Hello, my name is Ismatov Aziz. I am assistant professor at the Graduate School of Law at Nagoya University in Japan. And today I would like to share briefly about Uzbekistan's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and raise specific constitutional issues arising in the country at the moment. So at the first glance it might look like there is nothing special about the way Uzbekistan is handling the extraordinary situation with the spread of the virus. Since the middle of March, the Presidential Decree 5969 has declared a lockdown and further closed international borders, not only with other states but also internal borders within the country, namely between regions and states. The government also developed a series of other responses such as limited movement, limited trade and services, and also imposed certain tax preferences to particular business sectors, mainly small and middle-sized business, in order to help them survive during this unusual times. As an example, the limitations with regard to the movement include the prohibitions to drive your vehicle unless you have a special permission, which is actually really hard to obtain. And I think recently this prohibition was lifted, but not totally. So in some regions or cities you can drive only within specific hours. Also, people are not allowed to appear without a mask in public, and they have to keep a social distance. In all cases, the violation of strict measures may actually entail heavy fines or even imprisonment. But in general, the people of Uzbekistan seem to have accepted the restrictions on their personal lives without much hesitation. It probably only sometimes you can notice certain complaints in the social media, but as a matter of fact, such complaints are somewhat rare. As of now, all international business flights are terminated, and those, mainly citizens of Uzbekistan, repatriating home from countries, whether by the charter flights organized by the MOFA or ground transportation, will have to undergo a mandatory quarantine in state-owned facilities for 2 weeks. So on one hand, one may call this quarantine as a restriction or indefinite suspension of the right to move and reside freely, regardless whether you like those facilities or not. But on the other hand, the state has declared that the first cases of COVID-19 were actually detected in those people coming from abroad. So using such argument as a justification, the government has been warning that strict measures, even though such measures limit fundamental rights, are essential to address the great danger of infections possible and uncontrolled spread in the country. So another justification is actually a novelty of this virus and the mere fact that scientists do not have yet a comprehensive, extensive knowledge about it. So in such a context, Uzbekistan significantly existing criminal punishment for offences such as violating quarantine or refusing to submit medical examinations to treatment can be punished with up to 7 years in prison if such actions are deemed to lead to death of another person, or up to 10 years if there is a case of multiple deaths. Also, certain actions such as driving without permission or driving during the lockdown hours entail fines which, compared to local wage, seem unreasonably high. So whereas local public takes such limitations posed by the government as important steps to limit the virus spread and protect residents' health, including those affected, some international human rights watchdogs, such as for example the Human Rights Watch, call these measures as arbitrary and very disproportionate. There is an additional reason why actually respect for human rights and rule of law in general remains critical during the current crisis. The lockdown regulations are strict in scope and effect, and not only in Uzbekistan but also in many other countries. So we still need time to realize the final picture of effectiveness of such regulations and evaluate further the degree of their justification. But we have to admit that strict regulations in different countries do not affect everyone equally. So while middle and upper middle class people with secure employment are being inconvenienced by the lockdown, the effect on financial insecure and destitute societies is actually clear, devastating. So in such a context, Uzbekistan's people's limited concern about the rule of law and constitutional rights protection during the state of emergency raises certain critiques. As I live in Japan, I can see that introducing such quick and strong measures as, for example, we have now in Uzbekistan, very time-consuming or nearly impossible in Japan. Even after long parliamentary deliberations, the Japanese government couldn't impose a formal lockdown, but only issued an informal request to people to stay at home and keep their businesses shut to a possible extent. So in contrast, I think this massive obedience to the state orders in Uzbekistan has a kind of historical roots of complying with decisions of superiors, or, as we have now, outstanding leader. I think this echoes in attempts to draw an active interpretation of something called Asian way, or as we call in Uzbekistan, Oriental way, and it seeks to approach human rights on this basis. In concrete terms, it maintains the stance that for the sake of development, or as an example, successfully coping with the pandemic in the country right now, the imposition of restrictions on human rights, particularly on civil and social freedoms, is actually inevitable. So the special feature of such approach is to explicitly advocate the importance of the so-called overall national interests over the matters that can be sacrificed for the achievement of the so-called common good. Often such achievement is associated with a strong leadership whose rulings and decrees have a character of must obey equally for all. So I think these explains the strong obedience of people in Uzbekistan to be subordinate to the state for the sake of survival and the avoidance of a greater catastrophe. But simultaneously I see certain risks here. The lack of objection maybe not necessarily from the general public, but let's say from the civil society or judiciary, for example, the Constitutional Court. So far it hasn't provided any kind of opinion or at least any sort of formal evaluation. So the absence of additional objectives and thoughts, or what we call opinion juris, may give a sense that unanimous public support for extending existing restrictions or introducing further strict measures in the future may indeed be taken for granted. So such consequences may affect present condition of constitutionalism, which actually have already suffered a high degree of populism in the past, and it may create new challenges for human record in Uzbekistan. But again, by referring to the media, and not only a domestic one, but also the Russian-speaking media, we can notice that example of Uzbekistan, at least within the Central Asian region, is being very positively evaluated by the neighboring states. And in fact, if we take a closer attention what is happening not only in Uzbekistan, but in the wider picture of the Central Asia, one may easily find out that these kind of strict measures in Uzbekistan help to overcome the devastating consequences that some other states like Tajikistan or Turkmenistan facing right now. At the same time, we can notice that these kind of measures, peculiar to many other post-socialist states, if we compare, for example, Uzbekistan and Vietnam, we may find out that in most of the instances what is happening in those countries, I mean when it comes to the imposition of the strict measures on the national level, is actually very similar. Therefore, I think we still will need a time to analyze the situation in detail and realize whether those strict measures and the justification the country is using right now are worth of imposing in the country. So with this I will finish my brief talk about Uzbekistan, and I hope it was really insightful for you. Thank you very much.